So welcome to Marc Bolan, John's Children and Leatherhead's Bluesette Club Riding a White Swan, part of the Mole Valley Arts Alive festival that's ongoing at the moment. This started quite a few years ago when my good friend Matt mentioned to me, did I know that Marc Bolan once not only lived in Leatherhead but also played in a band in Leatherhead? And I said, well, I was kind of vaguely aware of it from books like this one by Gough Powell and Brian Hannigan. And we started to research it, and we found an awful lot of stuff. And we held a talk in 2017 was the first one, and since then we've had a plaque go up, as you'll see later on, and we've discovered an awful lot more people that played there, as you'll hear later on. So I want to dedicate this talk to two people. Firstly, Dr. Fred Maynan, who sadly passed away in April. Also my good friend Simon Burgess, nicknamed Pooh, sadly passed away much too young. So when we started our research, we put some articles in the Leatherhead Advertiser, courtesy of Mark Davison, really encouraging, and we got quite a bit of information came in terms of letters or phone calls or emails, including from Mick over here, more about him later on. More about those pictures later on as well. Without prejudice, why? I can barely remember yesterday, let alone 50 years ago, so some of it may not be accurate, but I've tried to only include things that we've verified with various places, and we know from several sources that what comes up this evening is accurate and true. But if you know more, then please feel free to collar me afterwards and enlighten me. So let's start the story, not in the 60s, but with this band in the sort of 70s, 80s, a local band in the 1970s called The Head. And the song by which they tend to be best known by is Nothing to Do in a Town Like Leatherhead. And it was a double A-side, as you can see, that with University 79, Nothing to Do in a Town Like Leatherhead. But is that true? Well, that picture, which is not very good, me perching on the steps in Leatherhead Museum, leaning over, trying to take a picture and getting some of the glass reflection. But that is the town in 1969, or certainly the part of the town that we're interested in, which is Bridge Street, which goes up here. So nothing to do in a town like Leatherhead. Well, it certainly wasn't true in the 1960s. That is from December the 15th, 1962. It was a dance, as they called it in 1960s, held at Fetcham Village Hall. On lead guitar in Fetcham was Jimmy Page. And there's the Crusaders and Jimmy Page on the right. So that's in Fetcham in 1962. Then we have the Rolling Stones playing at Epsom Baths in December 63, and the following day they played at the Guildford Civic Hall. Epsom Baths probably was quite a venue. Georgie Fame hated the sound. If you can imagine a swimming pool covered in boards, the acoustics were horrendous, which is what he said. But yeah, Epsom Baths, obviously quite a place to go for gigs and stuff. So Epsom, Guildford had the Beatles at the Odeon when that was there. Kingston had Cliff Richard. The Toby Jug in Tolworth had quite a few bands and acts performing as well. But what about Leatherhead? So here's a close-up of that aerial picture, and you'll see 22 Bridge Street. That's 22 Bridge Street, and the club we're talking about is this one at the back. So 22 Bridge Street. That's what it looks like. 22 Bridge Street. This is the early 70s, I believe, but in the 60s, it was a boutique called Carousel, owned by Jean and Iris, who were friends of Lynn Dudley, who worked there. Lynn being the mother of Jane, who at the time was the girlfriend of Andy Ellison, about whom much more later. And good evening, Andy, at the back there. Nice to see you. So here's the map. So you can see 22, and you can see this alleyway down the side. Let's go back to the alleyway. You can see the alleyway there. More about that later on, but you can see this alleyway from 22 down the side, and there's the works situation here, which is quite a vast site. Well, the works were Ventham's, which was coach builders at the time, a coach company, and they retained the property until it was sold to a property developer in the 1980s, and finally cleared in 1985 to make way for an office block, which is there now. So back to your picture again. Here's 22 and there's the alleyway. You can see it just there. If you go into Leatherhead Library, you can find a directory for quite a long time, long period. So 1960, bearing in mind things have to be submitted in advance, so 1960, so we have Bridge Street and we have 22A under the ownership of John Savanka, who I'm told was Polish, and it's listed as a cafe. 1961's directory has it now listed as a restaurant or Chuckwagon Steakhouse, 22 Bridge Street. It's only 22 at the moment. 64, 65, I haven't got the one between it, but it's now 22A, so it's moved behind, and it's called the Chuckwagon Restaurant. 66, 67, it's now a club called the Chuckwagon, 22A. 68, 69, it's now the Bluesette, also a club. And you'll see 68, 69 is then also become John's Children's Club. I'm not quite sure what the gap is there, but it's kind of both. So Bluesette, and at some point it changed the John Children's Club, as you'll see later on. So what I do know from various people is that the club that we're interested in started out as the Chuckwagon, as I'm sure most of you know. And a chap called Dave Thresh bought it around 1963, described by someone as, quote, an educated gangster. And he moved the club into the Nissen hut, sitting behind 22, that we now know as 22A. So alongside a jukebox, apologies for the quality of that, but alongside a jukebox, live music was there, as this rather blurred picture shows, a February the 26th folk concert by Royd Rivers and Jerry Loughran, blues, harmonica and guitar, advertising the club as a jazz and folk club. Membership were 2 and 6 or 2 shillings and sixpence, and with it says lunch and snacks served daily. That is what they look like, Jerry Loughran and Royd Rivers. Mr. Google's a wonderful place. So club regular John Brown said that in about 1963 there were 2 places to go. In Leatherhead, in town, there was a Sky High Cafe at the top of Bridge Street, which is now the kebab shop, at the time owned by a guy called Sid Palmer, who some of you may well know of, and also the Chuckwagon. But it wasn't all folk and blues. So John's Children started out in 1964 as the Clockwork Onions, and after personnel changes, the remaining people became the Few before becoming the Silence. We have a picture of them here. So bass or keyboards was Chris Dorset, Jeff McClelland on guitar, drummer Chris Townsend, and vocalist Andy Ellison. I hope I've got the right picture, Andy, but 35 Cobham Road? Yeah, good stuff. So that's the family home of Chris Dorset, 35 Cobham Road. It's just before the roundabout as you're going towards Lower Road, approaching that's just there. One of the founding members of the Silence and original bass player and also keyboards, Chris Dorset, it was their family home. And that's where the Silence rehearsed on a weekly basis. So Chris Townsend came to visit Dorset Senior, i.e. Chris Dorset's father, about a career in graphic design, and noticed a drum kit and guitars, so they began to visit regularly and played music together. Chris Townsend knew Andy, Chris Dorset knew Jeff McClelland, who in turn knew John Hewlett. And with the largest room in the house given over to rehearsal space, what parents, the rest is history. So that is 35 Cobham Road. It's actually subject to a planning application recently, developers wanting to demolish it, sadly, but I don't know what the outcome of that was, but that is 35 Cobham Road. It's definitely still there now, so if you're passing it, you'll see it, and imagine the Silence wandering up the driveway to go and have their weekly rehearsal, and some of them ended up living there as well. So, some band pictures. Here's John Hewlett and Andy of the Silence, 1965, Ashted Peace Memorial Hall. So, I guess John Hewlett stepped in to replace Chris Dorset when Chris went to continue his art school studies. And he chose the mod name The Silence after a recent Swedish film by Ingmar Bergman, and to contradict the fact that they made so much noise. An interview with Steve Marriott is worth considering. He was the lead singer of the famous band The Small Faces, and he tells of their then manager, the Small Faces manager, Don Arden, Sharon Osbourne's father. You might have heard of Don Arden. They once described, and rightly so, as the most feared man in music. And he came to see The Silence in the Chuck Wagon with a view to signing them. And it said that it was the irony of their name that first drew Don Arden to come and visit, because The Silence, as an R&B band developing similar material to the Small Faces, were anything but silent. So Don Arden called the band into his Carnaby Street offices and made them an offer. A provisional contract. The Silence would support the Small Faces at 4 shows, 2 in southern England, 2 in Wales, after which a full engagement deal contract would await them when they returned. The band's singer, Andy, sitting at the back there, later recalled that the gigs went down really well. The Small Faces were attracting the screaming type of audience, and The Silence got the benefit of that as well. And it's a weird experience, Andy was saying. So, the promised contract with Don Arden didn't come to anything further, but thinking about how Arden had ripped off the Small Faces, Steve Marriott described that as, quote, a lucky escape. I wish we'd had one like that. So, here's some Silence pictures. So, the Bluesette Club. This card's valid until December 1966. So at some point in 66, the Chuck Wagon became the Bluesette Club, better reflecting the more R&B style of the music then prevalent. Still owned by Dave Thresh, assisted by a chap called Digger Barnes, and when Dave was away, Tony Munday booking bands to appear. It's said that Dave Thresh and others at various times camped in the side part of the club, as did certain members of various bands and certain staff members, including Tony. So the club tended to be open on a Saturday all day with a coffee bar and a band in the evening, and there would tend to be a band on a Friday evening as well. A regular told me that his friends, aged about 16, 17, would always go there on a Friday evening. They'd arrive about 6:30, having been to a pub beforehand which would serve them, which at the time was probably the Duke's Head, and the band would come on about 8 o'clock, and after an interval would go on till about 11:30, and they would then repeat the whole thing on a Saturday, and other weekday evenings would just be the jukebox and coffee and soft drinks. Of course, young people being young people would smuggle in their own alcohol for consumption in the toilets, that or nipping out of the club to go to the Running Horses at the bottom of Bridge Street or the Duke's Head. So yeah, similar to any teenagers throughout history, really. Drugs were also a regular feature in the club. Mention of speed and Purple Hearts. Amphetamines that in the early 60s were said to be taken by tired housewives, but taken excessively in the mod culture of which some of these bands were a part of. It has been said, and the lady who told me is here this evening, so I'm sure she can verify it, that a brick was removed to reveal a stash of drugs hidden within the club. And someone else said that they were stored in the GPO telephone box on the site, so that the staff could plead ignorance when the police called and say, well, we haven't got a key, it belongs to the GPO, so we can't open it, officer, I'm very sorry. But yeah, speaking of whom, the police were said to be very noticeable by the fact that they had short, tidy hair as opposed to the regular clientele. So, Silence, Bluesette Club, 1966. And here's a set list for the club, 4th of June 1965, for the Silence. This is the sort of stuff the Silence were playing in 1965. So, if you ever read an article about the Silence that says they couldn't play, well, I'm sorry, but any band that can play those kind of songs and play them reasonably well, or well in their case, is a good band. So pretty good stuff on there, well-known songs. So, Simon Napier-Bell in the 1960s. In the context of this evening, what we're concerned about is the fact he managed the Silents who became John's children. Here's a picture of Simon with Jimmy Page on his right, our left, as well, to show that. So, that's John's children. How they came into contact with Simon Napier-Bell is really worth a talk, if not a book, and definitely a film all by itself. For now, let's say it involved an unexpected trip for a couple of them to the south of France, dancing with Brigitte Bardot, bouncing cheques, time in a French jail, and for one, a very difficult journey back to England. The owner of the checkbook, by the way, was the then manager of the club, one Gordon Bennett. Yes, that is his real name, and more about him a bit later on. And on one occasion, when I gave a version of this talk in Fetcham, one lady said that at the time she was the secretary to the local Barclays bank manager, George Graham, and she used to type the letters from him to Gordon Bennett, advising him about his unpaid cheques. Simon went to see the Silents at the Burford Bridge at a party by the swimming pool, eventually in the swimming pool. That's the Silents, I'm sure, not Simon Napier-Bell. But he agreed to manage them, and he changed their name from the Silents to John's Children to boost the confidence of bass player John Hewlett. He dressed them all in white and arranged for his solo artist Marc Bolan to replace guitarist Jeff McClelland. Partly because of Mark's perceived songwriting abilities, partly at the request of Kit Lambert, who was the manager of The Who and owner of Track Records, as Track Records wanted to sign John's Children to the label. And in due time, arranged for the club that they used, the Bluesette, to be purchased. Simon thinks, but can't quite recall, it was a lease rather than freehold, but he bought it for the group, gave them somewhere to rehearse, and was their headquarters. Described at the time as, quote, a bit of a dump, Simon made some improvements. So here's a picture of John's Children, 1967, and it shows their ages up there. And here's the NME, or New Musical Express, from May the 13th, 1967. So to get a front cover of the New Musical Express in the 60s is no mean feat for any band, is it really? Here's a different NME. This was May the 18th of March, 67, apologies. So, as that band, John's Children were active for less than 2 years, but they had a big influence on punk rock, are seen as many as the precursors of glam rock, and in retrospect, the band has been praised for the impact that they had, and their singles have become some of the most sought-after British 1960s rock collectibles. And the final paragraph of that article, which I should just read to you, we'll have on the screen in just a moment. Completely arrogant, cripplingly honest, totally naive, and four good, clean, healthy lads who sound like The Who plus blues. That's how Simon Napier-Bell was describing them to the NME. So that's their album, their famous album. It's a fake live album, in that it has cheers and audience screaming on it, but the audience screaming comes from a Beatles concert recording. So dubbed onto studio recordings, but it's their John's Children album, still available, but I'll show you something else in a minute as well. So here's John's Children in the club. This is quite a well-known picture, and it's a good one. It shows them in the club. It shows John Hewlett on bass, Andy Ellison lead vocals, Chris Townsend on drums, Marc Bolan on lead guitar, and there are various assorted bikers. As you can see, a biker gang in the Bluesette Club. So the stage was only about a foot high, wasn't a very big stage, and the ceiling therefore was quite low, so it wasn't unknown for some visiting guitarists to snag their guitars onto the ceiling. But yeah, quite why there's a biker gang member on the stage and another in front is not particularly known, other than the fact that they provided security for the band. So if you can imagine the band going to gigs wherever they went, they had a motorcycle escort, outriders of these people. Mick is sitting over there. Is one of the 3 founding members of the Bikers, known as the Sabres. The founder, a guy called Dave Swift, Michael, one of the original 3. Their logo, as you can see, is some crossed sabres, plus a couple of drips of blood. And your handle or your name, Michael, he'll tell you over coffee why, was called Animal. That was his one. He did crazy things, apparently, and ask his wife, I'm sure she'll verify that for you. But 60 to 100 members at their peak. So if you can imagine, as they did in those days, a horde of motorcycle friends, really, not really Hell's Angels, just a gang of friends that would meet together on their motorbikes. Can you picture them coming up, I don't know, the hill down the road there and congregating at the bottom of Church Road there and then going off to wherever they went to, the coast or Dorking or whatever. Quite amazing. And what a noise that would have been as well. Anyway, this is a picture inside the club, and you can see Andy there. So one regular described it as, quote, black as coal, with blacked out windows and like going into a cave. And Dr. Maynon, we saw earlier, he mentioned to me being a doctor on call and being called there on a Monday morning first thing, like 9 o'clock, walking into a pitch black club. And as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he started to see lots of legs of people sitting around the edge of the inside of the Bluesette Club. That's his abiding memory of visiting the Bluesette Club, probably the only time he visited that he remembered anyway. Apparently the floor was never mopped, it was seedy and filthy, but there was nowhere else to go. There's a memory of a never replaced broken coffee machine emitting an awful, horrible smell. Anybody that was there at the time, I don't know if that rings true for you, but that's what the club kind of looked like. That is not to scale, obviously. It did hold about 200 to 300 people. The doormen have been named as Jack Nary and Don Bird. And what's the name of the guy you said? Sue, what's the husband called? George. Yeah, George. Yeah, George Godwin as well. And you bought your ticket as you came in through a hole. You come in here, so here's the alleyway. There's 22, there's the alleyway. You come in here, go to the entrance, you buy your ticket, and you walk down this thing. There's like a partition wall kind of thing. There's a stage, and you've got all the dance area here, kind of a seated area kind of thing here, a coffee bar thing here, toilets here, and a patio kind of garden thing here, and it was fenced at the back. It looked like, not to scale obviously, but that's what it kind of was. That's John's children standing outside the club with bikers, obviously. Gives you the idea of the manufacture of it. It's kind of like a Nissan hut kind of thing, isn't it? Here's some pictures of John's children, not in the club, but just give you an idea of John's children. Double bass drum, I'm a drummer, a double bass drum, that's quite a feat. They were notorious for feathers. Ask Andy why at coffee time. But feathers became a regular part of their stage show, so you can see there's Mark and there's Andy and Chris Townsend and John Hewlett's behind him. They were supporting The Who. Imagine The Who. You know what The Who's like, don't you? They were on tour with John's children supporting them in Germany. And The Who got John's children thrown off their tour for being too rowdy. Give you an idea of what we're talking about here. So, photographs from the same photo shoot locally. So it's likely to be late spring because Marc Bolan joined the band in around February 67 and stayed until mid-late June 67. So we have John Hewlett on the left, we have, get this right, Chris Townsend, we have Andy Ellison, and of course we have Marc Bolan. So one of the best known photos is this one. And we wondered where it was until I got hold of this CD, which is a John's Children compilation, which includes their album and then lots of extra bonus tracks as well. And on the inlay inside, it says that picture is Fetcham Mill Pond. So we thought, well, that's Fetcham Mill Pond. Can we find it? Can we find the spot? Obviously, the trees will look a bit different than they did 50 years ago, but we'll find it. So we went down to Fetcham Mill Pond, my friend Matt and I, and had a look and see if we could find it. So there's an aerial view. There's Bridge Street. So the club's around about here somewhere. And there's the Mill Pond area. So you come down Bridge Street, over the bridge, down Mill Lane and along into there. Originally we were thinking surely a band wouldn't wander that far. Surely the photographs are by the river. But we couldn't find anywhere down by the river that seemed remotely accurate. And then we found this inlay and it gave it away. Solved. And you'll notice in the background there's a bridge. Well, that gives a little clue as to what might be there. So what are they? So, well, the bridge is the railway and the building behind it is the waterworks. So now we've got an idea of roughly where we're kind of looking. So we went and found it. Well, we tracked it down. So if you look at the bend in that path, the path goes down there to the end and it joins Mill Lane. So it's like a bend just round here. Well, if you look at this picture, you can see the path going down there. There's the bend, and at the end you've got Mill Lane. So obviously the bushes and trees are completely different, but this is 50 odd years later. So that is presumably roughly where it is. Obviously a fence there now, health and safety and all that stuff, but so yeah, that is where it is. There's the railway bridge in the distance. There's the waterworks. There's the aerial photograph. So if Bridge Street is up here somewhere, if you can imagine one straight line from there to there is roughly where it is, which is that picture. So if you're walking down past the mill ponds, in Fetcham Mill Ponds, have a look. You'll see it's quite clear to see where that bend is. There's John's children. And just along the path from where they were standing is a big, big tree. Is it that one? Which is still there, I don't know. I mean, it's 50, 60 years ago, 50 odd years ago, is that the tree? It kind of looks like it could be, doesn't it? Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, we'll see. Anyway, back to the music. So, here's that article again, and it says here, I'll read it to you. This is our club, the Bluesette, is a knockout. We choose all our artists. Last night we had Graham Bond, and next week Simon Dupree. Simon Dupree and the Big Sound. A British psychedelic rock pop band. At one time in 1967 they had a certain Reg Dwight, Elton John as he became. Graham Bond Organisation, a British jazz rhythm and blues group of the early 60s, and a correspondent, Stuart Hode, said he thinks he saw them twice. Well, the wonders of the internet, a site has the shows list January 1963 to March 1968, and it includes this. Found this recently as well. Here's a bookings list for the club, and this is from April 1966. Sons of Fred, it says, Rolling Stone, Bill Wyman. Does that mean that Bill Wyman came to the club? Sons of Fred, the Paramounts. Brian Epstein, Klaus. Surely that's got to be Klaus Voormann. And if you know your Beatles history, when the Beatles went to Hamburg, Klaus Voormann was one of the people in Germany that kind of looked after them and went around with them. As a few newspaper ads to give you an idea of some of the people playing. A band called The Night Shift. John Christian, to whom, along with his friend David Wells, I'm very grateful for sharing memories and memorabilia early on in this whole process, said to me, "This is a business card I was given to me by Brian Wiles on the night I went to see this band when it was at the Chuckwagon. There was a relatively small stage which was packed with instruments and amps. I will never forget the lead guitarist, who was fantastic, not only in his incredible musicianship, but how loud he was, a bit like The Who." The guy was Jeff Beck. This was 1963, and he joined the Tridents in 1964, who also played at the Chuckwagon. And of course, in 1965, he replaced Eric Clapton in the Yardbirds. The Byrds were an English R&B band formed in 1964 in London, and one of their members, recognise him? Ronnie Wood, this being his first band, and later, of course, with Rod Stewart and the Faces, and then and still with the Rolling Stones. Club regular Derek Hall, standing in front of some posters pasted to the outside of the club for a band called The Herd. Well, the Herd were a British pop rock group founded in 1965, and they launched the career of one Peter Frampton and achieved 3 UK top hits. In retrospect, we're not entirely certain if Frampton was in the band when the Herd played at the club, but you never know. Maybe he was. Well, in fact, it was 30th of January 1966 is when, certainly one of the dates when they played at the club. Jethro Tull. Earlier incarnations of the group, not naming themselves as Jethro Tull until 1968, certainly toured the area when they moved down from Blackpool to Luton in November 67. It's not known for sure, but it's understood that they did play at the club, probably late 67. And a website listing their gigs for that era, or that period, has a few noted as venue unknown. Dave, Dee, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Titch. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Yeah, autographed, there it is, and the lady that gave it to me. The Artwoods. Who are the Artwoods? This is an ad from December 1966, featuring one John Lord, later of Deep Purple. And there's the Artwoods with John Lord. I know there's at least 2 people here this evening who saw this next artist. Who's that? Cat Stevens, yeah, that's the one. He played in the club certainly on Friday the 24th of February 1967, and a couple of correspondents recall seeing him, and a lovely atmosphere, how one described it. And George Godwin, one of the doormen I mentioned earlier, told me, quote, "Men had to hold the women back." And there are at least 2 ladies here this evening who were there at that time, so maybe collar them at coffee time. Anybody recognise him? Alan Price, yes, formerly of the Animals, which he helped form in 1962, best known for their hit cover at the House of the Rising Sun in 1964. He played in the club one Sunday evening after he'd left the Animals, and he left them in 65, so he played there not long afterwards, with, it was said, a bottle of whiskey standing on his organ, and someone who described him not unexpectedly said he was very, very good. Tony Rivers and the Castaways, and a correspondent, Christina, who came to this talk in Dorking a few years ago, said, quote, "I was lucky enough to go there just once in about 1965. A good friend of mine from school had met up with the lead singer of a group who did cover versions of the Beach Boys and similar groups. She and I were just wild about the California sound and loved the way this group were performing our very favourite songs. They called themselves Tony Rivers and the Castaways. We were thrilled when they were going to play in Leatherhead, where we went to school, and found ourselves going in free as girlfriends. We were only about 15 at the time and had to persuade her brother to drive us there. We had the time of our lives and danced till we dropped." Tony later went and sang on albums by Steve Harley and Cockney Rebel, Pink Floyd, Roger Daltrey, Shakin' Stevens and Cliff Richard, and apart from being the voice of West Ham United's hit version I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles, is also the voice behind the theme Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads. It's him. Here's some more bands, and that's one of their singles, God Only Knows, the Beach Boys song. The Ivies. The first group signed by the Apple label, the Beatles label, in 1968, appeared several times at the club in 66 and 67, including with John's Children on the 17th of December 67, renamed Badfinger in 1969. So this is One in a Million, a band, and they had Jimmy McCulloch, later a member of Paul McCartney's Wings, in their band. The 4 Inches. Eddie's Crowd, couldn't find a picture of them. The Hounds. Fading Colours, not a very good picture, a bit faded, but that's what the Fading Colours look like. The Worrying Kind. Hines and the Wild Boys. The 5 Proud Walkers. The Mojos. The Foremost. Mike Stewart Span, The Bunch, The Fleur de Lis, The Creation, Richard Henry and the Time Box, or there's the Time Box, The Fenmen, Winston's Funds, also on that poster with the Fenmen. I don't know if anybody who was at the club remembers seeing any of these people, but they were certainly there because we have it on gig listing, so we know that they were there. Savoy Brown, the AJs. So the AJs included a guy called Trevor White, who later went on to join a band called Sparks. So more about them, or Trevor White, later on. The Ray King Soul Band, and there's a picture of the Ray King Soul Band. John Mayall's Blues Breakers. Who's the famous guitarist? Eric Clapton. And probably John McVie on bass, who was one of the founding members of Fleetwood Mac. They certainly played at the club. One correspondent recalls walking into the club one evening and seeing Eric Clapton sitting on a corner of the stage, dressed in a merchant navy jacket with long sideburns. But they were certainly there. One date they were definitely there was Sunday the 3rd of July 1966. And also a very early gig by this next band, Cream, with Ginger Baker, Jack Bruce and Eric Clapton. Can you imagine Cream in Leatherhead in the Bluesette Club? And also this next band. You probably can't read the writing, but it comes bigger in a moment. If you can see him, I wonder if you recognise who that is. I only discovered this in the last couple of weeks. A band called the T-Set, who you might say later became Pink Floyd, with, from Pink Floyd, Richard Wright, Roger Waters and Nick Mason. So the T-Set played in the Bluesette Club at least in July and December 1966. So we have an early version of Pink Floyd playing in the club, the T-Set. Here's a few pictures of posters advertising gigs on the outside of the building. That lady is called Linda Holland. So Tony Rivers and the Castaways, there he is. Yeah, there's Mick, Lynn and Bryn. Again, with some posters. Again, an idea of what the club looks like. A lady called Sue Hester, now Godwin, married to George Godwin. She lent me some of these photographs and she came to the unveiling of the plaque. And that's a picture of her with Chris Townsend and John Hewlett. Zoot Money's Big Roll Band. Zoot Money is still going strong, is still performing to this day. So one correspondent, Stuart Hode again, said he saw them twice. And here is Zoot on stage in the Flamingo Club in Soho with a guitarist. You probably won't recognise him from that picture, but you might recognise him from that one. Any ideas? Andy Summers of The Police, which takes us back to Surrey Sound Studios because the Police rock band in the late 70s, early 80s recorded their first 2 albums at Surrey Sound Studios in Kingston Road, with Andy Summers, obviously, as their guitarist. And here they are outside Surrey Sound Studios in Kingston Road. And here they are signing autographs for some children who've just been to Kingston to buy some records, and they stopped and get the police to sign them for them. Anyway, let's go back to the club. So, recordings inside the club. Remember, there's the club, and there's 22, and there's the alleyway. So, certainly a demo was recorded in the club with mics and a recording machine, and you might notice the name here, Pierre Tubbs, who's quite well known locally. He had his studio in Bookham, and using the 4 inches we saw pictured earlier for his studio session work. And Pierre has been described as an important soul to the local recordings of the 1960s, his work challenging the big independent companies to think again the way he did it. So a quote talking about a session in the club in 1966, someone told me, I was playing bass in another local band and we were asked to do a demo at the club of a song written by Pierre Tubbs, who came from Bookham. In 1965, he also recorded The Silence. There was a suggestion we may get some gigs in Hamburg and release the record, so we spent a long Sunday working on the song called I Can Go Down, which is that one. Well, as it turned out, we didn't get to record the record formally as it was given to Jimmy Powell and the Dimensions as on the record label. So here's a scan of the record, which, he says, I do have, as well as the group's card. Personally, the chap said, I think it's pretty good even for today. So others who might have visited, Dusty Springfield. It's possible, because Simon Napier-Bell was also helped write her first #1 hit, You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, and also is his book title. So maybe, I don't know. Jimi Hendrix, this is Leatherhead in 1966, 67, 68, well in this case, late 60s. So the only debate here, did he merely visit? Well, he certainly visited. There's no problem with that. He definitely visited. Did he play here? We don't know. Probably not a gig, but I can't imagine somebody like him turning up at a club like the Bluesette and not getting up and joining in. It'd be kind of weird for someone of his kind of background to not do that. But he certainly visited, definitely did that. But just picture Jimi Hendrix walking up or down Bridge Street in Leatherhead in the late 60s and then walking down that alleyway in Leatherhead. Yes, nothing to do in a town like Leatherhead. How wrong. Anyway, here's that book again. So Andy said to me, the bane of Simon's life was John's children and their vans because they lost several. Andy tells about their first van going the wrong way down a one-way street and ending up in a shop window. Another caught fire near Norwich. One went over the side of Box Hill, and one was left overnight in the access road that led down from the Bull Hotel, now Lidl, to the back of the club, only to be bricked in by morning. And Simon Napier-Bell, in this book about 60s pop, tells of one van floating out to sea during a gig in Bognor, one being deserted on the M1 after breaking down en route to Leicester, another abandoned somewhere in Germany, another burnt out at a busy intersection in the middle of the Champs-Élysées during a 2-week residency at a French rock club, and another, believed to be the one that came down from Scotland, left in a convenient parking space in Leatherhead, which turned out to be the foundations of a new building, ending up under 8 feet of concrete and office space. Mick took me to where he thinks it might be, under what is now the Flats car park, or the Flats next to the Swan Centre multi-storey car park. We'll never know for sure, but there's a map, an aerial map of the time to show the kind of area, and of course the road has changed a bit. We've now got the road that goes past the multi-storey and the Swan Centre and so on, but that's kind of the area, and you say you've got North Street here, and you've got Gravel Hill here, and you've got Bridge Street starting down here. So probably in that area somewhere there. And that's what an aerial photograph of that area looks like in 1969. So, I don't know, somewhere up there. Is there a van buried underground under lots of concrete with band instruments in it? You'll never find out, but that's the story, and it comes from a few places. So watch this space, I have no idea. Leatherhead Museum, 2016, and I believe they still have this one. This is a 1960s exhibition still on at the moment. The museum's not open every single day, but if you are in the area, pop in and have a look and see when it's open. Yeah, back to the music though. So, John's Children, Desdemona, released in May 1967. Reviews were good, press coverage impressive, healthy sales, but, and probably helping the sales, it was banned by the BBC because of the lyric, "Lift up your skirt and fly." Said to relate to Marc Bolan's obsession with things like witches and wizards, referring to a witch lifting up her skirt to mount her broomstick to fly, but the BBC, bless them, thought otherwise. Maybe they were right. I don't know. Come Play With Me is a song written by John Hewlett and Andy Ellison from August 67 after Mark had left the band, but with the B-side Sarah Crazy Child written by Mark, and this shows the garden at Clinton Road where the band lived in 1967. Their neighbour in 67 was a guy called Richard Quinnell, some of you might know him, who moved into number 8 with his young family. And they soon discovered, he said, that in the bungalow next door lived John's children, for a few months anyway, owned by the father of John Hewlett, who lived there, and a young daughter as well. When Richard bought his house, it was quite neglected, having been emptied for a couple of years. But on mowing their overgrown back lawn, he discovered numerous cola bottles and cans, and they had to ask the band to stop throwing their empties over the fence. And he does recall the band on one occasion, after heavy rain in Clinton Road, rolling about in puddles trying to swim. The bungalow was sold soon after the band left and demolished, and 2 smaller ones built in its place. So you won't find that particular bungalow anymore. And it would not have had a street number, just a name. But Richard's family were number 8, and number 10 is 5 houses away. So it's not exactly sure exactly where it was. A few more pictures from the photo shoot in the garden at Clinton Road. And here's a little review of But She's Mine. Why is that of interest? Because it features an uncredited guitar solo by Jeff Beck playing on the band's recording. Some pictures of the band. So these two must be the same time, mustn't they? Because they're wearing the same gear. That's obviously recording. Is that from Midsummer Night's Dream, Andy? Alexandra Palace. I think it must be. Must it from the video of it? Yeah. Midsummer Night's Dream at Alexandra Palace in April 67. Yeah, Desdemona. Here they are, that picture. Again, that's obviously taken from that earlier picture with the bikers in it standing out the front of the club. Here's Mark with a guitar. If you're a guitar aficionado, it's a Gibson SG, a very, very nice guitar. So someone told me early on in the research, I remember this petite chap suddenly appearing with crushed velvet trousers. It was excellent. In a tiny place like Leatherhead, it was quite a thing. So remember the AJs and Trevor White earlier, who went on to join Sparks in the 70s? That guitar was borrowed and later bought from Trevor White. The Sparks actually were also first managed by John Hewlett, so there's a lot of kind of connection there as well. But the guitar is now owned by a guy called Boz Bora, who, if you came to the plaque unveiling, you'll have met him. He's a huge fan of John's children, Marc Bolan, and he's also the co-writer and music director and guitarist for a guy called Morrissey. You might have heard of Morrissey, but he now owns that Gibson SG. So here's the band in the club, and here's the colorized version of the same one. You'll notice what's interesting as well with this is behind. Does it now say John's Children Bluesette Club? Is that what it says? As we saw from the business directory earlier, the club did become the John's Children's Club at some point, but when? Certainly before September the 3rd, 1967, because we have it here as the John's Children's Club, 3rd of September, 1967. There's John Hewlett's sister Marilyn on the right-hand side with the dark hair. And I have a copy of a letter that she wrote 19th of June 1967 that talks about the club now being called John's Children Bluesette Club. So there's the band without Mark. So Mark left the band in June 67, having played his last show on the 19th of May. So presumably this picture is late 67, early 68. So what happens to the club after The band ended in 1968. Consensus has it that it suffered a fire, perhaps deliberately, allegedly, perhaps set alight by the then owner Dave Thresh, allegedly. Someone has reported seeing him sitting on the roof while it was burning, watching it burn. Someone told me that they went to having heard about the fire, they went to have a look and see the club, and they saw the walls still standing, but parts of the roof caved in. In any event, it's understood that Dave Thresh went abroad. A while ago, several years ago, I was having a coffee and a sandwich in Waitrose, and a lady apparently in her 70s was sitting there, and she came and sat next to us. So my thought was, older lady, late 70s, maybe you're fair game to ask the question. So I asked her, were you here in the 1960s? And she was. She'd been here since 1962, and her husband, John Lloyd, had been a policeman here in the 60s. What was his nickname, Mick?
Wendy.
Pardon? What was John Lloyd, the policeman's nickname?
Oh, Budgie Lloyd.
Budgie, there you go. Ask Mick why later on. But she said he had, as a police officer, had lots of run-ins with a person called David, who ran the club, who later emigrated and used to send him postcards. So this picture is taken by Andy's girlfriend at the time, Jane Horling. We've got Chris Townsend on the left, next to Chris Colville, who was the manager of the club and sometimes filled in for Chris Townsend on drums. And the poster advertises a gig 4th of August 1967. The girl is a lady called Sue Carpenter, Chris Townsend's future wife. Here's a magazine article. Here's a close-up. And Andy told me, having seen this before, that's my gorgeous, effervescent and very funny girlfriend at the time, Jane. She is dancing with our crazy club manager, chauffeur, occasional John's Children drummer and supplier of pills, Chris Colville. It's actually a staged picture. They're not actually dancing. They're just adopting a pose so the photographer could take a picture. But Chris Colville, Pete Townsend of The Who, based the character Jimmy, the dysfunctional pill-popping teen, in the film Quadrophenia on Chris Colville. Jimmy was played by Phil Daniels. So this article here, you'll see, I'll just read it to you. It says, Leatherhead and the surrounding area is starved of entertainment for teenagers. Members of the John's Children told us, which could be one reason why it's so popular. It's managed by 22-year-old Chris Colville, who books promising groups to play every Friday and Sunday nights, although the local favourites are John's Children, who try to come back at least once a month. There is no licence, but this doesn't stop hundreds of teenagers filling the club on the 5 other nights of the week it's open. In the low lighting, as the latest hit records play, Chris is often signing in new members at £50 a year. So that's Jane, taken inside the club. And she told me, members of the club are a bit blurry. The daytimes, rehearsals, drinking coffee at the back of the club, tables and coffee machine, and nighttimes dancing under ultraviolet lights and smoke, often realizing that lights were showing our underwear as if that's all we had on. So that's Jane then. That's her and Sue Carpenter in 2015. So back to the directory. So by the 1970s, you can see here, there's 22, is now a solicitor's, and 22A is still billed as the Chuck Wagon. But 72 now, so 22 is now vacant in 72, and 22A is registered to PJ Carey, who is upholsterer's business. But he eventually got 22 as well, so 22 and 22A he bought. And he told me he bought the freehold of the site in 1970 for the grand sum of £3,800, having been, he said, advised by an acquaintance in the local CID that it might suit his purposes following their past observation of the site from an overlooking building in North Street. He also acquired number 22, and so the club premises became his workshop and 22 his shop front. He thinks Dave Thresh was somehow involved in the transaction, and I'm fairly sure he was the one that sold it to him. So at the time, and this is a picture of the rear of the club, it was fairly dilapidated, with plaster covered asbestos, walls and a roof. And he had to remove quite a few mattresses from inside, he had to install ceilings, and he had to completely rewire it. And Peter Carey owned the properties in around 1970-80. So that's the interior. Again, it's got the upholstery business in now, but it's now looking towards the former stage area, and it's now looking from the stage area towards the back. To give you an idea of the depth of the premises, obviously a lot tidier and a lot lighter than what it was in 1965, 66, 67. And that's like the side of the club. So you've got 22 at the back here. There's the club. And that kind of gives an idea of the kind of gap between the club and the wall as it was at the time. So some memories of the club. A den of iniquity. A great place to go. Our club was cutting edge. The time of our lives we danced till we dropped, as Christina said earlier. Excellent days. A good atmosphere, lots of young people having fun. Lucky to have this club in Leatherhead. Very seedy but lovely, smoky, slightly humid, stink of excitement. And the memories of the club have stayed with me all my life. And one more, a big happy family that met up every night. So a lady called Tricia, who lives in the States now, she also wrote to tell me, whoever ran the club at the time used to ask me and my friend to get up on stage with the groups and dance, the pair of us being a cheap pans people. We spent most of our evenings, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday, going there to dance. There was a largish private section in the back of the club, which at times we hung out in, but mainly we wanted to be on the dance floor. So not quite finished, but thank you for coming this evening and for listening. I hope you agree that Leatherhead would seem to have a very fine musical history, a pedigree even. So what became of some of the people mentioned? Simon Napier-Bell. In more recent times, or at different times, he's managed artists as diverse as the Yardbirds, Marc Bolan, Japan, Ultravox, Boney M, and Wham! And he got Wham! To be the first Western pop group to play in China in 1985 in Beijing. Gordon Bennett, you heard of him earlier. What happened to Gordon Bennett? There's Gordon Bennett. The man who saved Christmas Island. Yes, he did. He became quite a celebrity. It says here, known locally as, I can't pronounce that, but Big Brother Who Delivers, and he sadly died in 1991. English-born Labour advocate on Christmas Island, Bennett arrived on the island in '79 to take a post as leader of the Union of Christmas Island Workers, where he worked for the wage and safety rights of marginalised Chinese and Malay labourers on the island. Died in '91, buried in the island's Chinese cemetery, where his grave became a site of reverence with offerings of liquor and cigarettes left to him by Chinese and Malay residents. He's a famous person in Christmas Island, famous. And that's what he looked like in later years. So, who else? Andy. Andy has an autobiography out. I don't know if he's brought any with him this evening. If he has, I'm certainly going to get one. So if he has, ask for an autograph. It's an independent publishing. You won't find it discounted in W.H. Smith's, but if he has got some this evening with him, then buy one and get him to autograph it for you. But Andy is still performing to this day. I saw him a couple of years ago at Shepherd's Bush Empire as part of a Marc Bolan event. So here's Andy with Marc Bolan on the Marc TV show, I guess. And Marc Bolan, of course, what happened to him? T-Rex. Here's a concert ticket for Guildford Civic Hall, 1971. So I'm sure if you're aware of Marc Bolan, you all sadly know what happened to him. He was killed in a car crash. 16th of September 1977, a couple of weeks before what would have been his 30th birthday on the 30th of September. Tragic, much too young, but I guess it's kind of true that someone like him probably fits more into their short lifetime than someone like me fits into a lot longer lifetime. But it's strange to recall, if you're not aware of it, a conversation that Marc had with Simon Napier-Bell in 1967, talking about how John's children, or joining the band, might well lead to stardom and riches. And he said to Marc that if he started getting rich, he'd become like James Dean, someone Marc idolised, and buy a Porsche. To which it is said, Marc replied, "Oh no, a Porsche wouldn't be right for me. I'm too small. I think a Mini is the right car for me. If I was going to die in a car crash, it ought to be a Mini. I think I'd like that. It'd be nice." And of course, he was killed in a Mini, driven by his girlfriend, and it crashed into a tree in Barnes Common, and he died. Golders Green Crematorium, the Swan prominent amongst the floral tributes. And there's quite a few books commemorating his life, as you probably expect. And there's quite a few shows celebrating his life. Very good. If you've not seen that one, I strongly recommend it. Very, very good. So, Andy, he paid a visit to Surrey Hills Community Radio, myself and my colleague Adam Riches. This is in November 2015, and he came for an interview. If you want to listen to the interview, just drop me a note. I'll give you the details later, and I can send it to you. It's still available to listen to. But after we finished the interview, we went on a tour of the club site. That is what the site looks like now. So where the club was, obviously here, but it's not there anymore. It's sadly a car park behind some flats. And there's the alleyway, which is still there. So 22 Bridge Street, here. So we thought this needs commemorating. So we thought, we got in touch with the heritage people, and Rod Shaw at Mole Valley District Council was very, very, very helpful in terms of helping us to get this plaque sorted out. So with the research we'd done at that time, and with limited space available for words and letters, we created the plaque, and that was the draft wording for the plaque. So yeah, my grateful thanks to Rod Shaw for arranging that for the council. But the subtitle for this talk, noted on the slide, was Riding a White Swan. But why? Well, Leatherhead is famous for its swans. And someone mentioned to me seeing Marc Bolan sitting by a river, or by the River Mole, strumming his guitar. He would undoubtedly have seen swans either on Fetcham Mill Pond or the river. So was that the inspiration for the song, his first single as T-Rex, Ride a White Swan? I asked Simon Napier-Bell about this, and he told me, Marc wandering down to the river and being inspired by the swans. It's a good theory. Don't know. But isn't it fitting that the logo for the heritage plaques is the swan? So, back in January 2018, there's Bos Bora and there's Andy. We had a plaque unveiling in Bridge Street outside the Black Dog Gallery. So here is the plaque unveiling. There's Andy with the chairman of the council, Councillor Simon Ling. And we had a sing-song in the street with Andy and Boz leading their John's children's song Desdemona to the people joining in from the street. And there's the alleyway. There is the plaque. There's 22 Bridge Street. Here's the alleyway. And there it is. There's 22. There's my friend Matt, who instigated all this research all those years ago. And there's the alleyway. There's Mick striking a pose where the club was. So the club was here, but it's not there anymore, sadly. On YouTube, if you care to find it, you'll find after the plaque unveiling in Bridge Street, we went to a reception in the theatre, and Andy and Boz performed a couple of songs, and you can find this on YouTube. So it's them performing Desdemona. And yeah, sharing photographs around. Lots of people have brought photographs in and just chatting with people generally at the reception. So that is the plaque. Okay, so from this evening, you've gathered there are quite a few names that aren't on the plaque, perhaps could be on the plaque, perhaps should be on the plaque, but it is what it is. And after all, Marc Bolan, John's children, and the Bluesette Club were what started all this, and they're on the plaque. So I'm happy with that. I hope people are too. But wander down Bridge Street. I've said it a few times, wander down Bridge Street. Imagine the people we spoke about this evening wandering there too in 1965, 66, 67, 68. Stand in Bridge Street outside the Black Dog Gallery and look down the alleyway itself. Imagine, quite amazing to think, in little old Leatherhead, who'd have thought those people in Leatherhead. So that is the plaque as it is at the moment. Well, it's going to be, that is the plaque. There is if you're on Facebook or have access to Facebook, there's a Facebook page recently created, Leatherhead's Bluesette Club. There's also one for John's children. You can look at that as well. Definitely something to do in a town like Leatherhead. I hope you feel that like I do. Cheers.